Tonight's presentation is Owning and Flying a Homebuilt, What You Need to Know, hosted by Joe Norris. Joe is the community manager here for the Homebuilt community at EAA. And I'd like to point out this photo I just put together for tonight's presentation. Joe actually did the first flight of the Sonics that we built here. And it was successful, and just really pleased that it happened, and really pleased that Joe was able to do that. He was definitely the right person to take care of it. He's a Sonori builder, an A&P mechanic. He's an amateur-built DAR, which is probably particularly relevant for tonight's presentation, a lifetime member of EAA, and a member of our local chapter as well. So with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to Joe. Joe, welcome aboard tonight.
All right, thank you, Charlie. Appreciate that. And we'll go ahead and get our presentation going here. If I can get it, there we go. And we're going to talk a little bit about owning and flying home-built aircraft, as you mentioned. This is going to be a little bit of a review for those of you that certified your own home-built aircraft, because you probably went over a lot of this during your certification inspection with your DAR or your FAA inspector. For those of you that are purchasers of already flying home-built aircraft, some of this may be a good review for you, or it might be some new information for you. Those that purchase the aircraft after they're completed and flying don't have the benefit of going through the operating limitations with the DAR or the FAA inspector. So there may be some things in there that you don't quite understand, or maybe didn't really realize were in there, and we'll try to cover all those little things that are unique to operating a home-built aircraft. So we'll go ahead and get into it here if I can get the screen to advance. And for some reason it's not doing that. There we go. Now we got her going. Just a little background on the home-built aircraft community. There are over 32,000 home-built aircraft registered with the FAA today, with about 1,000 new ones every year getting registered. So sometimes it's a little less, a lot of times it's a little bit more than that. And that's fully 20% of the general aviation fleet. Who would have thought 15 or 20 years ago that home-built aircraft would be actually 20% of the U.S. general aviation fleet? But that's where we're at today. It's a growing community, and we expect it to stay that way. So let's see if we can. There we go. Home-built aircraft certainly are very unique and diverse. As you can see here, the pictures I have on this slide is quite a diversity of design. You have biplanes, you have sleek monoplanes, you have canard aircraft. Of course, in the home-built community, there's also rotorcraft, gyroplanes, helicopters, powered parachutes, trikes, gliders, all kinds of different aircraft. It promotes a lot of individuality. The aircraft are unique unto themselves, even though you have maybe a line of RV type aircraft. RV6s, RV7s, RV8s look fairly similar, but if you look at the aircraft up close and personal, you'll find that each builder has put his or her own unique touches to that aircraft, their own unique personality, and you can see that each one has got its own personality, just like the builders that built the aircraft. And of course, innovation is all about home building, and home building is all about innovation. Many of the things that you see on standard category aircraft nowadays have their roots in home builds, glass cockpits, composite construction, all kinds of things that are pretty much normal as we look at them today on standard category factory built airplanes actually came out of the home build community. So the home building movement over the years has added a lot to general aviation, and will continue to do so as time goes on. And of course, the big deal about home-built aircraft is about freedom. Both freedom of design. You can design any aircraft you want. As you can see, the picture on the right there is a head-on view of a Dyke Delta, certainly a unique plan form for an aircraft. Design's been around for 50 years now, and many unique designs have come out of the home-built community. And also freedom from the FAA from the standpoint of you're not as restricted on maintenance of the aircraft, and we'll talk about that as time goes on. Home builds really are something that appealed to a lot of people that are hands-on type people, builders, maintainers. People will say tinkerers. I don't know if working on an airplane is tinkering necessarily, but certainly if you like to get a little dirt under your fingernails, you like to turn a wrench, a home-built aircraft may be just the ticket for you. There are some important things to know, and we're going to talk about these things tonight as our program goes on. Aircraft documents, so the documents you carry in the aircraft, very similar to what you carry in a standard category airplane, but there are a couple of differences, and I'll talk about that. Talk about aircraft records, maintenance records as they for a home built and as it compares to a standard category aircraft. Operating limitations, it's a word you hear used, fairly frequently in the aviation community, but it has a little bit of different meaning with home builds than it does with standard category aircraft, so we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about the regulations as they relate to both operating and maintaining your home build. So covering a lot of those areas to try to show you the similarities and the differences with the home build community as it relates to the overall general aviation fleet. The documents you carry in your aircraft, and this is going to look familiar to anybody that's been a pilot, aircraft owner for some time. You need an airworthiness certificate, which must be displayed. As I look at different aircraft here at the convention and around different airports, I see some confusion there. A lot of owners have the registration certificate displayed instead of the airworthiness certificate. It is the airworthiness certificate itself that needs to be displayed. The regulation, I believe, says in full view of the crew or passengers. Basically, that means that someplace in the cabin of the aircraft you have a little pocket with a clear plastic cover or some kind of an area where you can put that airworthiness certificate so that when you stick your head in there and look around, you can see that airworthiness certificate itself. And we'll show you what one looks like here in just a second. Operating limitations. If you're talking about a standard category airplane, that usually includes an FAA-approved aircraft flight manual or pilot operating handbook. There is no such thing for a home built. There's no FAA-approved flight manual or pilot operating handbook. And certainly, it's a good idea to develop one if you're flight testing a home built or if you just bought a home built and you're unfamiliar with it. If one was not provided, we can help you actually develop a flight manual or pilot operating handbook for the aircraft, but that is not part of your FAA-required operating limitations. The operating limitations is actually a document you'll get from the FAA along with the airworthiness certificate, and we'll talk about that as we go on here tonight. And you need your registration certificate, which shows the registered owner and the N number and all the identifying information for the aircraft that must be carried, and also a current weight and balance report. So pretty standard stuff, just looks a little bit different for a home built as it would for your standard category aircraft. Let's talk about those operating limitations a little bit. It is an actual document that is issued by the FAA. It is a part of the airworthiness certificate. The FAA considers the actual little certificate itself and the operating limitations to be one document. The entire thing must be carried in the aircraft. The airworthiness certificate itself be displayed, as I mentioned. The operating limitations document needs to be in the aircraft. If you leave it on the bench and go flying, you're actually flying an aircraft illegally because the entire document needs to be carried in the aircraft. I certainly recommend that the owner or operator of the aircraft to make a copy of those operating limitations and keep a copy with the aircraft records on your bench or at your shop so that you can just leave a copy in the aircraft. You don't have to pull them out and refer to them because that always promotes the accidental forgetful putting it back in the airplane. So make a copy of it. I'd certainly even make a copy of the airworthiness certificate and have that with your records just in case it's ever lost or blows out of the airplane or somebody steals it. Amazingly enough, people do steal these things once in a while. I don't know what they're going to use them for, but it has happened. But have a copy of it in case you ever do need to replace it. It gives the FAA a head start on getting replacement documents for you. So certainly doesn't hurt to have copies in your aircraft records at your shop or at your home. The operating limitations actually outline what is required or allowed for that individual aircraft, and I say that specifically because operating limitations have changed over the years. Operating limitations that were issued back in the 60s and 70s don't look a lot like the ones that are issued today, so there may be some differences and disparities between one set of operating limitations and another, and that's important if you're moving from one home-built aircraft to another. If you own a home-built and you know what your operating limitations say, you cannot just assume that your buddy's home-built aircraft is the same. Each aircraft is required to operate under the operating limitations issued to that individual aircraft. So make sure that you look at the ones that go with the aircraft you're going to fly, and make sure that you understand what they say, because while they are supposed to be standardized, those standards have changed a little bit over the years. So if it's an older aircraft with an older set of limitations, you'll find some differences there. So familiarize yourself with the document that has been issued to that aircraft that you're going to fly. It'll talk about the flight test in there. We're not going to talk about flight testing tonight. That's a subject of a whole other presentation that I've done and will do again. That's kind of a process onto itself. We're assuming that the aircraft we're talking about today has been flight tested already, but the requirements of that flight test were called out in the operating limitations, and it stays in there even after the flight test is done, so you can refer back to that. It'll talk about aerobatics. Is the aircraft allowed to do aerobatics or not? And that's important too, because we've actually run into situations where through oversight or mistake or whatever, there have been aircraft that are supposed to be aerobatic aircraft, but they've been issued operating limitations that didn't allow aerobatics. I helped a member with a Pitt Special, I mean the most aerobatic of any home built in its day, and here he had an aircraft that wasn't allowed to do aerobatics according to the operating limitations. So we had to go back to the FAA and apply for a new set of operating limitations and get that fixed for him, because obviously you buy a Pitt Special, you want to do aerobatics. But make sure that if you're planning on doing aerobatics in an aircraft and you know the aircraft is physically capable of those aerobatics, check those operating limitations and make sure that aerobatics are allowed, so you don't get tripped up on that. Also talks about night and IFR flight. Is that allowed for the aircraft if it's properly equipped? And we'll talk about that, how that shows up in the operating limitations as we go along in tonight's presentation. But really the operating limitations are kind of a little mini set of regulations that applies to that individual aircraft. It talks about all these different things in there, and you kind of got to go by not only the basic FAA regulations, some of which do or don't apply to home-built aircraft, but also the operating limitations which do apply to that individual aircraft that you're operating on that given day. Here's what the documents look like. In the upper left there, you'll see the an actual airworthiness certificate. It happens to be a blank one that I just scanned for this presentation, but it is pink. All of the special airworthiness certificates for home-built aircraft are pink in color. That's not a temporary. I get a call every once in a while saying, oh, my aircraft's got a pink airworthiness certificate. It must be a temporary one. No, that's actually the permanent certificate. The only airworthiness certificates that are white are standard airworthiness certificates. Your Cessnas, your Pipers, your Beechcraft, they'll have white ones. It'll say standard airworthiness certificate at the top. Your home builds have a special airworthiness certificate, which is pink in color to differentiate that. And it has the designation would be experimental, and the purpose would be operating an amateur built aircraft right at the top, and then it goes on to describe the aircraft, make, model, serial number, N number, and all those different things. That pink piece of paper is what needs to be displayed in the aircraft. So when you look in the aircraft and you find that little document holder with the plastic window on the front that you can see through, that pink airworthiness certificate is what you want to see looking out at you through that clear plastic. So make sure that that's how you have the documents arranged in the aircraft. Also in the aircraft, but not necessarily displayed, will be the registration certificate, which on this slide is right below the airworthiness certificate there. It's a white piece of paper. It's kind of a little hard card, kind of a thick piece of paper. And it is the certificate that shows the aircraft is actually registered with the FAA, shows the registered owner, shows the N number, and all the different identifying info. That has to be carried in the aircraft as well. And then on the right-hand side of the page is just the front page of a generic set of operating limitations as we issue them today. The way I do them and the way they kind of come out of the FAA order, it's a 4-page document, so there will be 4 pages stapled together. The front page will have the FAA logo and letterhead at the top, as you see here. My particular office is the Small Airplane Directorate Manufacturing Inspection District office out of Minneapolis. That's the office that authorizes me as a DAR, so that's why my sample has their address at the top. Of course, that address would be whatever office actually issued the operating limitations. And then again, the aircraft's identified make, model, serial number, and N number, and then it goes on to talk about different things. This first page happens to have the flight testing requirement right there, phase 1. Number 1 talks about the fact that it needs to be flight tested. Number 2 talks about the flight test area. It'll be a radius around an airport, or it might be some GPS coordinates or lat launch coordinates or whatever they use to describe the flight test area. Sometimes it'll actually say, see the attached map, and it'll actually draw the flight test area on a sectional map and have that attached to the operating limitations so that you can visually see it. Lots of different ways to describe flight test areas. So again, whatever is in that particular document is what applies to that aircraft. And number 3 tells you how many hours the aircraft needs to be tested. It'll typically be 40 hours. Sometimes it'll be 25 if a particular engine and prop combination is used. But that'll tell you what the minimum flight test period is right there in the operating limitations. And the 4th paragraph on this front page talks about how to sign the flight test off when it's finished. And I'll touch on that a little bit more here in just a second. But that's what the documents look like. They need to be in the aircraft. If you're looking to purchase an aircraft, one of the things you're going to want to find is to make sure that those documents are in the aircraft. We get calls quite frequently of people, they find the airworthiness certificate and the registration, but they can't find the operating limitations. Again, that's probably because somebody pulled them out and left them on a bench someplace, or they got lost. If they are lost, you can get a copy from the FAA that is part of the aircraft's permanent record. So if you've lost your operating limitations or the aircraft you're considering purchasing doesn't have them, you can call the FAA aircraft registry out in Oklahoma City and they can provide you with a copy right out of the aircraft records. So it's always something that you can get a replacement for without any problem. But make sure they're in there because they have to be in there to legally fly the aircraft.
Joe, before we go on, I have a question from John. He's got an ultralight, and what documents would be needed? There's a lot of home-built ultralights out there.
Right, and the term ultralight is a little bit confusing in this day and age because there's a lot of people that still apply that term to an aircraft that sort of looks like an ultralight but has 2 seats and thus is actually an aircraft in the FAA's eyes. If it's a single-seat ultralight that actually fits the ultralight definition, 254-pound empty weight, 5 gallons of gas, and all those things, there is no documentation needed for that. It's not even an aircraft in the eyes of the FAA. It's an ultralight vehicle. So the FAA doesn't have any documentation requirements or licensing requirements on a true ultralight. If it's a 2-place aircraft that looks like an ultralight, let's say it's a Quicksilver or something else that is an ultralight type vehicle but actually has 2 seats, that is an aircraft in the eyes of the FAA, and it would have to have all these same documents that we've been talking about. It has to have an airworthiness certificate, registration, operating limitations, all those things would apply to that aircraft.
And I had a follow-on question from Adam about, could you explain it for light sport as well?
Sure. The only difference of what we're talking about today between amateur built and light sport is what it'll say on the purpose for the airworthiness certificate. The documents will look identical. And in most cases, they are identical. There's a few minor changes in the wording for a set of operating limitations for a light sport aircraft, but the document will look the same. The airworthiness certificate will look identical. The registration will look identical. The only difference will be it'll say operating a light sport aircraft in the purpose instead of operating an amateur-built aircraft. So all of this that we're talking about today applies almost equally with a few minor changes in the language. The same stuff applies to a light sport aircraft. Okay, aircraft records, and there is no set format for aircraft records. We're basically talking about maintenance records here. Most people use aircraft logbooks. My illustration there is actually the experimental aircraft logbook that we sell here at EAA. We designed that specifically for experimental aircraft, but any aircraft logbook will work. A loose leaf binder will work. A spiral bound notebook will work. The FAA doesn't care how you keep the records. There are some records you must maintain, and there are a lot of other records that are darn nice to have that aren't really legally required to be maintained, but you should have aircraft records. So again, most of the time it's going to be in aircraft logbooks. There's typically a separate log for the airframe, which this green book, the aircraft logbook, would be an airframe log. You'll have a separate logbook for an engine. You may have a separate logbook for a propeller, especially if it's an adjustable propeller. So you may see 2 or 3 books that come with it. We like to see the airframe and the engine records separated because you may remove that engine from the airframe someday and put a different one on or sell that engine or whatever, so you want the records to go with the engine. So if you have that all in one book, it's hard to do that, so we recommend having a separate book for the engine records. But in any case, regardless of how you keep them, there are some things you must maintain in the aircraft records. And for an experimental aircraft, there's some specific things that you want to look for. This is, again, good information if you're going out to consider purchasing an amateur-built aircraft or even a light sport aircraft. These things, if they are not in the records are not complete, and certainly is an issue that you need to get beyond before you'd make that purchase. And one of the most important things in those records is the completion of the flight test. We've run into more cases than I'd like to see of aircraft that are out flying, have got hundreds of hours on them, have been flying all over the country, and nobody ever signed off the flight tests. What that means is the aircraft was never authorized to go outside of that restricted flight test area, and it was never authorized to carry passengers. So the aircraft has been being operated illegally for all of this time since the flight test was physically completed, since nobody signed it off in the logbook with appropriate record. The FAA, in the FAA's idea, that aircraft is still being flight tested. So make sure that that flight test completion entry is in the aircraft records. That's a very important part of the records of the aircraft. So that's job one if you're looking at an aircraft to purchase, or if you're just going through your own records and making sure everything's up to snuff. Make sure that that flight test has been signed off properly, and I'll show you that sign off here in just a second. The operating limitations are going to tell you that the aircraft needs to be inspected periodically. It'll typically say every 12 calendar months, which is equivalent in that respect to an annual inspection for a standard category aircraft. You'll always hear people saying they're going to do their annual. It's actually not called an annual on an experimental aircraft. It's called a condition inspection. The reason that is because the FAA has some legal definitions for the various terms, and the legal definition in the FAA's eyes of an annual inspection tells you that you're going to compare the aircraft to its type certificate. And since experimental aircraft don't have type certificates, you can't compare the aircraft to a type certificate, so you can't do an annual inspection. So if you had a mechanic doing your inspections, and that mechanic's been signing your experimental aircraft off as annual inspections, he's actually using the inappropriate terminology, and if the FAA legal department really wanted to get nitpicky, they would tell you that your aircraft is not properly inspected. So make sure you use the terminology that's called out in the operating limitations again, and we'll talk about that here in a second as far as what that's supposed to look like. But every 12 calendar months, that inspection needs to be recorded. Now, when you say calendar months, it's important to know that that means your inspection runs until the end of a given month. The word calendar is what helps you out there. If you do your inspection on the 1st of July, your inspection is good until the end of July the next year. If you do your inspection on the 15th of October, it's good until the end of October the next year. Some of the old operating limitations, and I'm talking about way back when, numbers of years, decades ago, some of them used to say every 12 months without the word calendar in there. And if you happen to have an older home built with a set of really old operating limitations and it says 12 months without the word calendar, that means that the inspection expires on the date. So if you did it on the 15th of October, it would expire on the 15th of October 1 year later. They haven't done it that way for years now. The term calendar months is supposed to be in there, which gives you the opportunity to run the inspection all the way till the end of the month. So this, again, make sure that the wording is in there in your operating limitations. And if you do have equipment like a transponder, you're required to get that transponder tested every 24 months, just like as if that transponder was installed in your Piper or Cessna. So that needs to be recorded in order to operate that transponder legally. If you are flying the aircraft IFR, you need pedostatic tests. All those kind of things are the things that you'll be looking for in the aircraft records. So in many ways, very similar to your standard category aircraft, but flight test completion is one that's completely unique to experimental aircraft, and also condition inspections rather than annual inspections. here is what that entry looks like by today's standards for the end of a flight test. So you complete the 40-hour flight test or whatever that might be. This is the verbiage that is called out in your operating limitations to be written in the aircraft records. So this is the entry you'll look for when you're checking those records. It basically tells you that somebody, the flight test pilot, has certified that the aircraft has completed those flight tests, and all this legal language is in there. And some information has been recorded that was developed during the flight test. VSO, your landing configuration stall speed, VX, best angle of climb, VY, best rate of climb, and the gross weight of the aircraft and the CG location at gross weight where those numbers were developed. Now, note that I said gross weight. Whatever number is written in this entry in the logbook becomes the legal gross weight of the aircraft, because the FAA says that any maneuver or any operation that you want to do outside of flight test must be tested. So if you want to test the aircraft, let's say the aircraft design is 1,400 pounds, but you only test it to 1,320 because you want it to be an LSA, if that's doable for your design, you would write 1,320 at this weight, and you should test the aircraft at 1,320, obviously. But whatever number is written in that flight test block, that becomes the legal gross weight of the aircraft, because that's what it's been tested to. So make sure that that number makes some sense, whoever wrote it in there. Make sure that that agrees with what you think the gross weight is supposed to be, or find out why it's different if it is different. And that may make a difference of whether you purchase that aircraft or not, if that's what you're looking to do. But it's really important that this entry be with the aircraft. If it's not, then the FAA has no record of the flight test being completed. You have no record of the flight test being completed, and from a legal standpoint, the aircraft is still in flight test until that entry appears in the records. From the late 70s on back, the FAA didn't do it this way. They originally had it set up where you would complete the flight test and then you'd go get a new airworthiness certificate. Rather than just signing it off in the logbook, there would actually be a new certificate issued. So if it's an older home built, a 60s or 70s vintage home built, you won't find this entry. You'll actually find an unrestricted airworthiness certificate, and the operating limitations won't say anything about flight testing, because they used to issue a whole new certificate and a whole new set of operating limitations after the flight testing was over. So anything that was done from about the late 70s or real early 80s on up, you'll start to see these flight test entries in the records. So understand that there may be some differences there.
Joe, and as I recall, on the really old ones, phase one, or the flight test phase, actually the operating limitations had an expiration date oftentimes, right? And the really old ones, 20, 30 years ago.
Yes, that is correct. That's the way they used to control the flight testing. They would actually issue the certificate for 1 year and let you do your flight testing within that 1 year. You'd either complete it and get a new unrestricted certificate, unlimited certificate, or you could apply to get a new flight testing certificate for another year if you didn't finish the flight testing. But that's the way the FAA did it up until about the early 80s, give or take.
Okay, we have a couple of questions that are appropriate right now. Shannon would like to know whether the 40 hours minimum flight testing is based on Hobbs or TAC time, or how do you measure that?
It's actually based, the FAA doesn't really specify one way or the other. A lot of people will use TAC time. Some people will use Hobbs time. It's actually the time on your watch. Literally, it is 40 hours. So however you log it in your aircraft records is how you're going to count that 40 hours. So certainly actual watch time, typically an hour goes a little faster on your watch than it does on the TAC. Hobbs is usually an actual hour. But you can record that any way you want, as long as it makes some sense that you're using some kind of a timekeeping device to record that 40 hours.
Okay, and then Guy had a question about, you talked about establishing the gross weight here. What if a second owner purchases it and wants to, say, amend either up or down the gross weight of that aircraft? Can they retest it?
Sure, that's a good question, and you actually can retest it, and I'm going to talk a little bit in a little bit later on down the program here tonight about making changes to the aircraft, so I'll kind of cover that at that time. But for now, I'll just tell you that yes, you can change the gross weight of an aircraft under certain conditions and by doing certain testing. So we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Okay, a condition inspection will look like this or something very similar. I do them a little bit differently than this because I put the date right at the beginning rather than sticking it in the sentence, but this is the way it's shown in the operating limitations. I certify the aircraft's been inspected on a given date in accordance with the scope and detail of Appendix D to Part 43 and found to be in a condition for safe operation. Notice it does not use the term airworthy, because again, the FAA has an official definition for the term airworthy, and it involves a type certificate. A standard category airplane can be airworthy. An experimental aircraft cannot legally be airworthy, but it can be in a condition for safe operation. So that's the term you need to use, and that's why it's called out this way in the operating limitations. Now, what I generally do when I make this entry is I'll date it right away at the beginning, put the total time of the aircraft right away at the beginning like you do with your normal maintenance entries, and then I'll go on and make the statement leaving out the date. I certify this date's been inspected in accordance with, and on and on. Either way is okay because the operating limitations always say this or a similarly worded statement. The key is you want to call out the specifications for your inspection program, Appendix D to Part 43, and you want to call out that it's in a condition for safe operation. That's the key to this whole thing. You need that in there every 12 calendar months in order to be able to continue to operate the aircraft. If it is an aerobatic aircraft, you'll find in the record some sign off that aerobatic maneuvers have been tested. Again, the FAA does not allow you to do any maneuver in normal operations that was not tested during a flight test period. So aerobatic maneuvers would need to be tested either in an initial flight test period near the end, or you could re-enter a flight test period later on down the line and add maneuvers. And again, that's part of the major change stuff that I'll talk about here in a minute. But either way, once you test those maneuvers during a flight test, you're going to want to make this entry in the aircraft record showing that the aircraft was tested for whatever various maneuvers, a loop, a roll, whatever type of roll you're doing, a spin, whatever that might be. You want to list all the maneuvers. What I like to see is while it's not really specifically shown here, I think it's appropriate to list the maneuver and maybe list the entry speeds that you use for that maneuver, whatever pertinent information you feel is necessary. But at a minimum, you'll want to see this entry in there. You'll want to see that the operating limitations allow aerobatics, and then you'll want to see the entry in the aircraft record showing that the aerobatics have been tested. So look for that if you're buying something like a Pitts or a Skybolt or even a lot of RVs that are capable of aerobatics. You'll want to have that in there.
Joe, I got a good question here from Shannon. She says, or he says, the kit manufacturer says that the kit is designed to handle, +6, -3. Does that mean that I have to actually pull that number of G's during Phase 1 flight testing?
No, that's a good question, and you want to do aerobatics. I mean, the aerobatic instructors teach you to do the aerobatics pulling the minimum amount of G's you can to complete the maneuver, so there's no reason for you to test the aircraft all the way to those limits. You're just assured by the manufacturer that it has been, or you hope at least that he tested those limits if he's saying that that's what it is stressed to. And all of the good kit manufacturers do that, but there's no reason for you individually to test your aircraft to those limits. You just want to go do your maneuvers, do them with a minimum load on the aircraft. There's no sense of putting any stress on the aircraft you don't need to. So just test the maneuvers through your normal operations, do the maneuvers as you normally would, and hopefully you'll complete them without ever getting anywhere near those aerobatic G limits. Okay, maintenance. This is the part where home-built aircraft really shine from the standpoint of money saving for an owner, because you are your own mechanic on a home-built aircraft. FAR Part 43 is actually the maintenance regulations. If you go through the regulations, all the various parts, Part 61 is pilot certificates, airman certificates as they call them. Part 91 is your general operating rules. Part 43 is the maintenance rules. And the key to this whole castle here is that the maintenance rules in Part 43 do not apply to an experimental aircraft. There are a couple of weird conditions where they do apply, but that doesn't enter into our conversation tonight. A home-built aircraft is an experimental aircraft since its inception, so Part 43 does not apply. That means that there is no restriction on who performs the maintenance on that aircraft. Anybody, and literally I mean anybody, can perform maintenance, repair, and modification to the aircraft. You don't have to be the builder. You don't even have to be the owner. You don't have to hold any kind of an FAA certificate in order to do that maintenance legally. Anybody can do the maintenance. So even if you purchased a home built that you did not build, you are allowed to do maintenance on the aircraft. Now, there is one slight catch to that, and that is well, I'll talk about inspection in a minute. When you get to inspection, there is actually a requirement that you hold a certificate, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But for just your general maintenance, you change a tire, you change the oil, you fix the radio because it's not working, the antenna was wire was broke or whatever. Whatever you want to do as normal maintenance to that aircraft, even up to and including repairs, rebuilding the engine or rebuilding the entire aircraft as far as that goes. No restrictions on who does that. So you're not needing to take that to a shop and pay a shop rate to have it serviced. You're welcome to do all of that yourself. And that's where home-built aircraft really come home to being really lowering the cost of aviation. Modifications. This is where we get into this thing where Shannon was asking about doing modifications after the fact, or maybe adding aerobatic maneuvers, as we were talking about a minute ago. In the operating limitations, it'll talk about major changes. That's the term that's used. And the FAA has a definition of a major and a minor change. It's found in FAR 21.93. And you can see here in the quoted sentence, major changes has an appreciable effect on the weight, balance, structural strength, reliability, operational characteristics, or other characteristics affecting airworthiness. Now, there's a little bit of a catch here, because no place in the FAA documents anywhere in any document do they define the word appreciable. So it's up to you to decide what's appreciable as far as, let's say, a weight change. Is 5 pounds appreciable? Is 10 pounds appreciable? Well, a certain amount of that's going to depend on what your aircraft weighs to begin with. But it really is a common sense thing. And the way I explain it is that if you really have to think hard about whether it's a major change or not, if you really can't decide, it probably is. And if that still doesn't pass the test, then the next way to think about it is, if you were ever called in front of an FAA administrative law judge and asked to explain yourself, would your explanation that this change is not a major change hold up? And in your own mind, how do you feel about that? And that's really a good way to answer it on a lot of things. There are some things that the FAA almost always decides is a major change. One of the main ones you'll run into is propellers. If you put a different make and model propeller on your aircraft, the FAA is probably going to consider that a major change. The reason being is because you may have some weight differences or some ballast differences. You will probably have some performance differences, which would be operational characteristics. You may have reliability issues because of vibration. All of those things would go into a propeller change. So the FAA is 99 times out of 100, the FAA is going to tell you a propeller change is a major change. Now, that doesn't mean you can change the pitch on your ground adjustable prop. They're not going to argue about that. But if you take one make and model off and put a different make and model on, they're going to say, yep, that's a major change. Another thing that's a major change is fuel system layout. If you add a tank, or if you add a fuel pump, or if you replumb it to a different configuration, anything that changes the ability of that aircraft to deliver fuel to the engine will be considered a major change. A lot of the accidents that happen in home-built aircraft relate to fuel delivery, whether it's fuel, it's usually not fuel exhaustion, although that happens once in a while, but it's usually fuel starvation because the fuel's just not getting to the engine. So fuel system changes are major changes. Obviously, if you change the entire engine to a different make and model of engine, that's going to be a major change because there's weight, structural, reliability, everything goes into that. So those are the kind of things that typically are major changes. If you make a biplane out of a monoplane, that's obviously going to be a major change, and I laugh a little bit, but there actually have been aircraft that you can do that to. So it's not out of the realm of the possible. Here's an obvious one, putting floats on. You've got a Glass Star or a Super Cub replica. You've flown it on wheels. Now you want to put floats on it. Putting the floats on is a major change. You change all kinds of weight and balance things. You change all kinds of operational things, structural things. Those are major changes. So those are the kind of things. But adding aerobatic maneuvers would also be a major change because you're going to go test a new maneuver the aircraft's never done. That's how you would do that. You would go into a major change situation. The operating limitations describe what you need to do for a major change. The newest version typically just says you have to approve a flight test area with the FAA, and then you go out and test your major change under flight test conditions, day VFR, pilot alone in the aircraft within the restricted area. You get done with the major change testing, 5 hours minimum for a structural change. One flight would be enough for a aerobatic changes possibly. But whatever it takes to do that major change test, sign it off just like you did the initial flight test with the same logbook entry in the tested configuration, and you're back into normal operations. So raising the gross weight or lowering the gross weight would be the same thing. One little caveat on lowering gross weight. If your idea is to buy an aircraft with a gross weight higher than 1320 and lower it to 1320 so you can make it sport pilot eligible, that doesn't work. The FAA says the aircraft must always be at 1320. If it is ever operated at a higher gross weight, it's ineligible forever. So don't get the idea you can lower the gross weight to make it meet sport pilot. It's not going to happen. The FAA doesn't allow that. So keep that in mind. Some people do raise the gross weight, though. If you build a Super Cub replica and put it at 1320, the next owner wants to put it at 1400 or 1500 or whatever the maximum design says it can be, you can go ahead and do that. It makes it ineligible for sport pilots to fly it, but you can expand the operational envelope of the aircraft. You would do that through a major change situation.
Joe, you mentioned floats, but what about skis?
Same thing there too, Charlie. That's a good question. Skis would be a major change the first time they're installed. And let me clarify that. You would only have to test the installation one time and log it as a major change. So if you have floats or skis, the first time you put them on, you go through the major change process. You sign it off as a major change when you're done with your flight testing. Now that configuration is a tested configuration. You can switch back and forth from wheels to skis or wheels to floats anytime you want, now that they're tested, and you don't have to do the test again and again and again. You only have to do it the one time. So if you have a float plane, put it on floats in the spring, put it back on wheels in the fall, or you put it on skis in the fall and put it back on wheels in the spring, no problem. You'll test it the first time, sign off the major change, and you're good to go.
Joe, there's a couple of questions, and I think we just need to clarify this. We're using an FAR reference for modifications, but what do you actually do with the, as far as the guidance on how you handle your major change, where do you find that?
That's right in the operating limitations, Charlie. Good question. There's an actual fairly long paragraph in the operating limitations that talks about after. It'll start out saying after incorporating a major change, and it goes on to describe what you're doing. It'll tell you it's a minimum 5-hour flight test. It'll tell you that you got to talk to the FAA about a flight test area, and it'll give you the sign-off that you do to finish out that major change flight test. That's, again, right in your operating limitations. Any change that doesn't rise to the level of a major change, you're going to pull one radio out of the panel and put another one in, or you're going to change the upholstery. You're going to put different wheels and brakes on, and the weight is very, very similar. Lots of things like that are changes that you make that don't rise to the level of a major change. And if you're going to do that, again, anybody can do maintenance and modification and repair. You would just go ahead and do the change. We certainly would recommend you log that in the aircraft records, removed shin brakes and installed Goodyear brakes or whatever it might be, tested operationally okay. It's a typical maintenance entry that you could make. You can do that as the owner of the aircraft or as the pilot of the aircraft. Again, no FAA certificates necessary, but certainly just for your own records and for the records of those that may operate the aircraft later on down the line, I would certainly recommend you put some kind of an entry in the aircraft records telling what you did, but if it's not a major change, there's no interface with the FAA that's necessary. Okay, inspection, we talked about that. I said, again, that's required by the operating limitations every 12 calendar months, but now you need some sort of an FAA certificate to do that inspection. This is called out in the operating limitations. Again, you won't find this in the regulations. You'll find it in the operating limitations, and it'll tell you in there that there's 2 authorized individuals that can do that inspection. The first one is the repairman certificate holder for that aircraft. The original primary builder of a Homebuilt is authorized to apply for a repairman certificate, and this is one place where we get some confusion. Just because you built the aircraft does not automatically make you the inspector. You have to make the application and receive the repairman certificate. It's a separate process you do after you certificate the aircraft. So if you're the original primary builder of your Homebuilt, you talk to the folks at the Flight Standards Office, the FSDO. There's an application form you fill out and you show them your build records, and there's a little interview process that goes on, and you'll get the repairman certificate. Once you have that certificate, you are authorized to perform those condition inspections each year. You're authorized by your operating limitations. If you bought the aircraft already flying, you're not the original primary builder, you don't have the repairman certificate, the original repairman certificate holder may continue to do those inspections even after that person sells you the aircraft if they want to. oftentimes they don't want to, so you must move on to find somebody else. And any A&P mechanic is that somebody else. It has to be an A&P. The A&P does not have to have an inspection authorization. No IA is required. Just an A&P mechanic license in and of itself authorizes that person to do that condition inspection. Now here's a place where you want to give some thought when you're doing your maintenance, because in effect that A&P mechanic, when he or she signs off your condition inspection, is basically saying that all the maintenance is done on that aircraft in the last year looks good to me. They're signing off the condition of that aircraft on the date and time that they sign the inspection. So you really should develop a rapport with your A&P mechanic that's going to do those inspections for you each year, so that they're comfortable with your mechanical work and you can go to them for advice or help or whatever, and then they have a lot better comfort level when it comes down to inspection time. They can come and perform the inspection. They know you've been doing good work. They're familiar with your work, and it makes things a lot easier to get that condition inspection signed off. So a little bit of PR on your point beforehand, and a little bit of getting acquainted with your local A&P or your A&P that's in your EA chapter or whatever it might be will go a long way towards getting that inspection taken care of when it comes time to do that. And of course that inspection is recorded in the aircraft records. If it's not recorded in the records, it never happened as far as the FAA is concerned. So that's one of those important entries that needs to be entered in the aircraft records, is the completion of that condition inspection.
Joe, we have a question here from Rebecca. If two people are involved in the original building of the aircraft, can both apply for and receive the repairman certificate?
Great question. The FAA issues one repairman certificate per aircraft for a home built. So between the two people, they'll have to decide who is the primary builder, the person that was most responsible for the preponderance of the work. They're not going to both be able to get a certificate. So when you have a group of people building an aircraft, a partnership or whatever, among themselves, they'll have to decide who the most appropriate person to hold that repairman certificate might be. Father and son team, father-daughter team, mother-daughter team, it makes a lot of sense for the younger person to get the certificate because, according to the actuary tables, the younger person should survive the older person. Hopefully that'll be the case, so that certificate would be valid longer. It's not transferable. It doesn't go on to another sibling down the road or whatever, so one person's going to apply for that and get it, and they're going to hold it for their lifetime, basically. Okay, we talked about the records, we've talked about some of the maintenance issues. Let's talk a little bit about operating. And one of the questions we get quite often is, can you fly the home built at night? Or sometimes people even want to fly them under instrument flight rules. The key to whether the aircraft legally can do that is, again, found in the operating limitations. And you'll want to look in those limitations and find something very, very similar, if not these exact words, something that says very similar to this. It has to be listed in the operating limitation that allows the aircraft to fly at night or IFR, and it will always relate back to the equipment list in FAR 91-205. When you open up your FAR book and you look up 91-205, it's going to tell you that that's the minimum equipment list for standard aircraft. And because it says standard aircraft, that FAR does not directly apply to an experimental aircraft, because an experimental aircraft is a special aircraft. It's not a standard aircraft. So for a day VFR experimental aircraft, there is no minimum equipment required by regulation. But if you want to fly it at night or under IFR, you go to the operating limitations, and there is where it tells you that now you have to apply with 91-205. So you look at the list, and it has some day VFR listings from instruments, and then it has night, and it'll say for night you need all the day stuff plus this night stuff, and for IFR it'll say you need all the day stuff and all the night stuff plus this IFR stuff. So it's a building block type approach like that. If you want to fly the aircraft at night or under IFR, you'll need to meet all of those equipment items listed under the minimum equipment listed in 91-205. But before you even equip the aircraft, you need to have this entry in the operating limitations. So it goes back again to those operating limitations. I'm sure that by now you understand how important that document is. So, but yes, the aircraft can operate at night or IFR after Phase 1 flight testing is completed. Phase 1 by definition is done day VFR only. The operating limitations will tell you that as well. But once the Phase 1 is completed, Phase 1 is another term for the flight test period. That's what the FAA considers it. Phase 1, and then Phase 2 is your normal operations. But you need this entry in the operating limitations. Once that's in there and the aircraft is properly equipped, you're good to go. And the other big question comes about can I fly the aircraft over densely populated areas? Now this is a little bit of an interesting thing too, because once again, no place in any FAA document is there a written definition of a densely populated area. So it's a little bit up to the good judgment of the pilot and the FAA to decide whether the aircraft has or has not been flown over densely populated areas. So there is a little bit of fog in the air there as far as my version of a densely populated area might be a little different than yours. Common sense is the prevailing entity here in this case. During your flight testing, this first entry that I have here on the screen will be the controlling document. Except for takeoffs and landings, the aircraft has not operated over densely populated areas or congested airways. Period. That's a flight test requirement. Once flight testing is over, that stays in effect to get your takeoffs and landings taken care of. In addition to that, though, the second entry in your operating limitations kicks in. Notice that it starts out by saying the aircraft is prohibited from operating congested airways and densely populated areas. Sounds pretty familiar. But then it goes on to say that isn't true unless it's directed by air traffic control. So if you're flying, let's say you're at Oshkosh here, those of you familiar with Oshkosh know that the aircraft is right on the south edge of town. If you extend a downwind north from the airport, you're going to be over a densely populated area. It's pretty obvious to see that. But if the tower told you to do that and you're not in the flight test phase, you can do that because now you're legal to do that because your operating limitation said that ATC direction will allow you to do that. So, okay, if you're taking off or landing, you can do it. If ATC tells you to do it, you can do it. Or you've got one more here that you can jump into. If you maintain sufficient altitude to effect a safe emergency landing if your power unit fails without hazard to persons or property on the surface, then you can fly wherever you want. So in other words, again, your good judgment is going to come into play. If I fly over this town and the engine quits, can I get the aircraft on the ground without hazard to persons or property on the ground? So if you land on the street and you don't hit anybody's mailbox or their car or anything, you're good to go. If you do hit something on the ground, they could press you for being in violation of this operating limitation. So good judgment prevails, and you can operate the aircraft as you see fit as long as you have sufficient altitude to do emergency landing if you need to without hazard to persons or property on the ground. So again, the combination of these two operating limitations allow you to take off and land and operate over densely populated areas under these conditions. So yes, you can fly the aircraft over densely populated areas within reason.
And Joe, the safe emergency landing language sounds a lot like what I normally have to have under 91 and just general operations.
Absolutely. This is basically lifting it right out of the Part 91 operating rules. I mean, obviously, the FAA's, one of their main jobs is protecting the non-flying public. So everything that we do in our flying is supposed to be in deference to the safety of people and property on the ground. So that's very, very similar to any operating regulation that you would follow under Part 91. That's very true. This you'll find in every experimental aircraft operating limitation, whether it's amateur built or light sport or exhibition or R&D or air racing or whatever it might be. You'll always find this. This comes right out of FAR 91-319. It says no person may operate experimental aircraft, any experimental aircraft, for the purpose of carrying persons or property for compensation or hire. So in other words, you can't sell rides in the aircraft. You can't hire out to haul somebody's cargo. You can't carry anything in the aircraft other than yourself and your passengers and your own personal gear. As long if you're getting compensated for that carriage, you can't do it in an experimental aircraft. So this is why you don't see them being used as Part 135 charter type aircraft or anything like that, or selling rides at the air show. You can give rides out of the kindness of your heart, but you can't sell rides in the aircraft. So that's a standard operating limitation for every experimental aircraft in the U.S. registry. Another thing that people don't sometimes realize is when you're flying into or out of an operating control tower, you need to tell them you're an experimental aircraft. When you do that, simple enough, just on your initial radio call up, I'm experimental Sonex 208 Golf Delta is an aircraft that I just flew. Charlie just finished building here in a group of EAA employees. great little aircraft, by the way, but when I called the tower, I say experimental Sonics 208 Golf Delta. You don't have to say experimental every time, but you have to tell them on your initial call-up that it is an experimental aircraft. Only at control towers. You really aren't required to do that for an approach control or at a non-tower airport. Most pilots get in the habit of saying it. They say it all the time. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's only required to be done when you're talking to a control tower. The other thing your operating limitations tell you is if you're filing an IFR flight plan, you're supposed to put experimental in the remarks section. I'm not really sure what that does for ATC. They handle the aircraft the same no matter what in my experience. But your operating limitations, again, goes back to the operating limitations. It'll tell you that they want you to put experimental in the remarks section on an IFR flight plan. So there's a couple of things about identifying the aircraft as experimental that you need to be aware of. Another thing to be aware of is that the airworthiness certificate of an experimental aircraft is actually only valid in the U.S. It's not recognized by the International Council of Civil Aviation. So you can only fly the aircraft in the U.S. unless you have written permission to fly outside of U.S. airspace. Now, if you're going to go to Canada, it's real easy. We have an agreement with Canada whereby you just download a form. They call it a standardized validation. It automatically validates your airworthiness certificate in Canadian airspace as long as you meet the requirements called out on the form. And if your aircraft's legal to fly in the U.S., I guarantee you it'll meet all those requirements on the form. But you need to download and carry the form in the aircraft to prove that you're validated in Canadian airspace. We have a similar arrangement with the Bahamas. If you want to fly your aircraft over to the Bahamas, you download the form, you put it in the aircraft, you have the written permission right there, you go fly. Those are the only two that we have a standing arrangement with. If you want to go to Mexico or any other country, you actually have to contact the Civil Aviation Authority in that country and get a letter from them telling you that you're authorized to fly in that country. So unlike your standard category aircraft where you just go ahead and fly across the border because the certificate is recognized through the ICAO, that doesn't work with experimental aircraft. You need to be aware of that. Get that permission, carry it in the aircraft, and you're good to go. So other things to keep in mind that don't relate directly to the operating limitations of the airworthiness certificate, but if you're purchasing or thinking about purchasing an experimental aircraft, one of the things that sometimes comes as a bit of a shock is the insurance. The insurance industry, the aviation insurance industry is a small industry as compared to other insurance industries, so it's a little bit tighter controlled as far as what they'll cover and what they won't cover and what the rates they're going to charge. So you need to make sure that you understand the insurance situation for you with the aircraft that you're considering. They're going to look at the design history and the fleet size of that aircraft, and by fleet size I mean how many of that individual model are out there, how many RV6s are there, how many Sonorays are there, how many HATS biplanes are there that are insured. They don't care how many are in the fleet, they actually look at how many are being insured because that's the number they work with. I mean, they're working with numbers here, dollars and cents primarily. So they're going to look at how many are typically insured and what the design history is as far as safety. So they're looking at, it's obviously a game where they play. They look at their tables. What's their possible chance of having to pay out a claim on that particular design. So the rates are going to vary by design. They're also going to vary for you individually based on your pilot background and your experience. If you're a pilot that has a lot of experience in one particular performance category and the aircraft you're looking at is a completely different performance category, not necessarily up or down, but whatever, that's going to be something that's going to affect the rate you pay, or in extreme cases it may affect whether you can get insurance or not. So be aware of that sometimes insurance is a little bit harder to find, and usually can be found. It may be a little bit higher price than you're used to paying for your Cessna or Piper. You can get training if you need to. The FAA has a program called the Letter of Deviation Authority, which we contract into the word LODA. If you want to make your experimental aircraft available for hire to do transition training, you've got an RV6, you're a CFI, or you know a CFI that will work with you, and you want to make that aircraft available for other potential RV6 pilots, you can actually get a letter from the FAA that allows you to charge a fee for your aircraft to use it for that transition training. So in other words, now you are allowed to carry persons for hire because it's for this transition training purpose specifically. The FAA will allow that as a flight safety issue. So There are aircraft around the country that are authorized to be given out for training. You can do training in the aircraft without charge in any aircraft. So if you have a friend or a chapter member who has an RV6 and you're going to thinking about buying an RV6, you can go ahead and fly your buddy's aircraft with a CFI, or maybe your buddy is a CFI, or whatever you need to satisfy that time and type that the insurance company is looking for. Any way that you can satisfy that, the FAA is going to be, or excuse me, the insurance company is going to be happy to see that 25 hours time and type, 5 hours time and type, whatever it might be. They may or may not require that to be signed off by a CFI. Depends on the situation, but be aware that you're probably going to have to meet some kind of minimum experience level to get insurance on your experimental aircraft. EAA Flight Advisor Program will help you find that experience. If you're looking to talk to a flight advisor, check with your chapter. You probably have one in your chapter. If not, call us here at EAA headquarters, and we can get you in contact with a flight advisor that'll help you plan that transition into that unfamiliar aircraft. For insurance, we certainly recommend the EAA insurance plan. There's the toll-free number you can call to get information on that. You give them a call there at 866-647-4322. And that'll get you in contact with the folks that'll help you understand what you're looking at as far as potential rates and coverage for the insurance of your experimental aircraft. Another thing to keep in mind is that each aircraft is unique. Like I said before, even if you got a whole line of aircraft that all seem to be very similar, they're all RV series aircraft, or they're all very EASs, or they're all Pitts biplanes or whatever. They were all built by unique individuals, so there are going to be differences from aircraft to aircraft. And your A&P mechanic may not be familiar with that particular design or how it's laid out or anything, so there's going to be a learning curve there. If you're purchasing an aircraft already flying, you're going to depend on that A&P to do some condition inspections for you. There may be some education you need to do with that A&P to get them up to speed on how that particular aircraft is configured systems-wise and structurally and everything else. So be prepared for a little bit of a learning curve there. EAA Technical Counselor Program can help you with that. Again, through your chapter, you can find a tech counselor to help you, or call us here at EAA headquarters. We'll get you in contact with a technical counselor that is familiar with whatever particular kind of aircraft you're looking at. There are type clubs for a lot of the various designs that are very helpful as well. The Vans Air Force for the Vans RV series. There's a HATS club for HATS biplanes. There's all kinds of different aircraft. Central States Canard Group for a lot of the Canard designs. If the aircraft has been built in any numbers at all, there's probably some kind of a type club, either web-based or other type club-based. You may or may not have to pay dues to be in it. They're all very helpful, though, especially if you're new to that particular type as far as looking to purchase or learning to fly it. The type clubs are a great place to go ahead and get some kind of support in that regard. So be aware that type clubs are out there. Other resources, of course, EAA is your main resource for any and all things home building. We have the website. We have a home built section on the website you can get into, and there's lots of information on there about owning and operating and building experimental aircraft. Our Oshkosh 365 forums are very helpful. We've had a lot of good conversation on there regarding different people looking for information on various home built designs, or maybe some questions about building or maintaining. Certainly would encourage you to sign up for Oshkosh 365 and become involved with that through your local chapter. Of course, there's lots of help available. We have our Aviation Services Department here at headquarters available to answer your technical questions. I'll put the contact information for that up here just in a second. Our safety programs, flight advisors and tech counselors, I already mentioned them. Those are available through EAA headquarters here and through your local chapter. The type clubs and various sites all over the internet. In our internet age nowadays, it's really easy to find information. Of course, sometimes that information is worth what you pay for it, so be a little bit careful when you're just reading stuff on the internet. Make sure you verify that the information is correct by several sources and whatever. But certainly the type clubs and us here at EAA can help you with that. There's the contact information for aviation services here at EAA. It's a toll-free number. You're welcome to call. We're here 8 to 5 Central Time, Monday through Friday. You can email us, info@eaa.org. We've got several folks here in the office that are stand ready to help you with any and all questions you might have. So please do not hesitate to call us or contact us here at EAA. It is a member benefit for you. There's no charge for that. You can call as many times as you want, and we'll try to get you helped out as best we can. If we don't know the answer, I'm sure we know somebody that does. We'll get you in contact with the right people. So we're ready to help you. Just give us a call or drop us an email. Charlie, what do we have for questions? I think that covers my prepared presentation here tonight. So we'll see if anybody has any questions. We can take them now and get them taken care of.
Well, we have quite a few, Joe, so we'll see what we can squeeze in here. There's several questions related to your comment about the prohibition on amateur-built aircraft being able to carry persons or property for compensation or hire. And most of the questions were about, hey, what about sharing the operating costs? So if I give a ride to a passenger, can they reimburse me for some of the fuel and oil?
That's an interesting question, and I say that because there is not a black and white answer to that question. I have actually had FAA employees at the headquarters level tell me that a strict reading of the regulation would not even allow sharing of expenses because that is in fact compensation. So by the letter of the law, if you really want to be squeaky legal, the answer would be no. Having said that, common sense tells us that it's going on all the time, and as long as there's no willful holding out for hire, you don't hang a shingle out and say, I'll sell you a ride, I don't think the FAA is going to get super critical on that. We don't know of any case law where anybody's ever been actually held accountable for something like a cost sharing, but a strict reading of the regulation would actually say that even sharing expenses would actually be compensation. So with that in mind, go forth as you see fit.
Okay, several questions came up when you're talking about major changes about aircraft like the Glass Star, where you can convert them from tricycle gear to tailwheel and back and forth. What are your thoughts there, and how is that a major change, I guess, number one? And then number two, how might you handle that since you know you might be swapping the gear more than just once or twice?
Sure, exactly. That's a great question. That would be exactly the same situation as if you were putting floats or skis on. It is a major change that you would have to test the first time you make the conversion. Now, there's a couple of ways to handle that. If your aircraft is all set up and you've already built it to you know you're going to swap it back and forth, you could actually test both configurations during the initial flight test period. And you do that test and you would sign it off in both configurations. So you'd actually do two flight test sign-offs at the end of your 40-plus hours, however long it takes you to test it. You do one flight test sign-off in tricycle gear configuration and list the stall speed and the best angle and best rate of climb and all those numbers. You do another exactly the same sign-off or an addendum to that sign-off that would show the numbers for the tailwheel configuration. So you'd have both configurations would be tested. Once they're tested, and once they're signed off in the logbook, now you can switch it back and forth every day if you want. There's no additional testing that needs to be done other than an operational check to make sure the brakes are still working and the tail wheel steering works or the nose wheel steering works or whatever the case might be. There's no major change once the change is tested. It only needs to be tested once. So test the tri-gear, test the tail wheel, test it with floats, test it with skis. All of those things would be a major change the first time, and then after that they could be changed back and forth as the owner sees fit.
Okay. Bob has a question. He's not the builder. However, he's replaced or repaired / replaced the starter and alternator. Are these considered maintenance items, or would that also be a major change?
No, that's going to be a maintenance item. Certainly you're replacing something with something very similar. There's not any kind of an appreciable weight change. There's not any kind of an appreciable balance change. There's no real airworthiness issue there. You take a starter off, you put a starter on, or whatever it might be. That's just a straight maintenance item. Certainly I'd recommend that Bob make an entry in the logbook stating that he removed such and such a make and model and serial number of starter and installed such and such a make and model, just to have a record of what was on the aircraft and be able to track that for maintenance purposes, but there's no major change involved in anything like that. So he's welcome to go ahead and do that as the owner. Like I say, you don't even have to be the owner, but typically it's the owner or operator that's doing those types of repairs, and you don't have to be the builder in that situation.
Okay, and early on, Joe, we had 3 different questions about DARs. I'll go with Alvin's question, which was he's completed his first Homebuilt almost 20 years ago, and the FAA inspected it and issued the airworthiness certificate. Does the FAA still do Homebuilt inspections, or will I need a DAR to license my next one? And then, what are the differences of using a DAR versus the FAA, and then also just where do you go about finding one?
Okay, great questions. The FAA legally, and I say legally because it's part of their charge to do home-built inspections, and many FAA offices still will do them for you, but it's pretty low on their priority list, so you may have to wait quite a while to get it done by an FAA inspector. So a lot of times it's quicker for you to go to a DAR. Now the big difference is that the FAA inspector is being paid by your tax dollars, so there's no fee of any kind if the FAA comes out to do it for you. There's no fee for the inspection, no expenses. It's basically paid for already by your tax money. If a DAR does it, you'll almost absolutely pay travel expenses and copying and mailing and other direct expenses, but many DARs actually charge a fee for the inspection. A DAR is a private individual that's authorized by the FAA, but they do not work for the FAA as an employee, so they're like a private contractor, so they are actually allowed to charge whatever fee they would see fit to do that inspection. So you'll get the DAR there a lot quicker generally, but it may cost you up to, in some cases, several $100s to get that DAR to do the inspection for you. So if you want to wait long enough to get the FAA out there, that'll cost you less in money but more in time. The other way around, cost you a lot less in time but could be considerably more in money to get the DAR to do it. In either case, the ultimate result is the same. They both issue the same airworthiness certificate and operating limitations, and so what your result is going to be the same. It's just how you get to that point is where you're going to end up making the difference.
Okay, and I'm sorry, did you cover where we could get one?
Basically start with your FAA office. We have a list of DARs here at EAA headquarters if you want to go directly to a DAR, but I would always encourage you to first call the FAA office. You may get lucky and have an inspector come into your area for some other job, and he'll be able to work you in and take care of you with no cost and fairly low amount of wait time. So start with your local FAA office and ask them the question, can I get my aircraft inspected and how soon? They will tell you either yes or no, and if they say no, they'll say, well, we've got these DARs, and they'll probably have a list of them there that you can get right from them. So another place to go would be your EAA chapter. Ask around, see what other people's experiences are. There may be a DAR in your area that's really well known and really good. There might be an EAA volunteer DAR like myself where they won't charge you a fee for the inspection. They'll only charge you the direct operating expenses, the travel, the copying, the mailing, whatever that might be. So just for, a smaller amount of money, it's still going to cost you a little bit of money over and above an FAA inspector, but the DARs that are working as volunteers can save you a good bit of money and still get somebody there on a timely basis to get your inspection taken care of.
Yeah, and I might add, if you're looking for that list on our website, probably the easiest thing is just to email us at info@eaa.org, and we can send you a link directly to the members-only area where that's located. A couple of questions here I'm going to try to, we got two that are similar here. Craig has an RV-8, was issued an airworthiness certificate in November of '99. It does not have the flight test completion note in the logbook, but just a note, stating that it was inspected by the FAA, given an airworthiness certificate. So where does he go from here, since it's obviously been flying for a while?
Yeah. That's a good question, and the way that the really legal way to do that would be to go back to the FAA and say, hey, I've got this aircraft. There's no record of the flight test being done. It's got this many hours on it. It's done this many things. How do you want me to handle it? And the FAA inspector, if they're knowledgeable, they may give you some kind of a sign-off to do without any further testing. They may give it a minimal flight test time that they'd want you to go specifically do a flight test. But really, you've got to satisfy the FAA. It's their requirement that it be flight tested, and you have to meet their requirements there. So I would definitely get with the FAA. What you may want to do first, before you do that, is to get a copy of the aircraft's records file from the FAA in Oklahoma City. It costs you $10. You can get a CD that has all the records from that aircraft. It may be that aircraft was originally done under a flight test where they issued a separate airworthiness certificate. I mean, just because they typically quit doing that back in the early 80s doesn't mean that one was done that way later. The FAA has that option, so it may have had an airworthiness certificate, done a flight test, and then be issued a new airworthiness certificate without making any kind of entry in the log. I doubt that's the case, but it could be. So get the records from the FAA in Oklahoma City, look and see if there was a previous airworthiness certificate issued. That might have been a flight test airworthiness certificate, and they might have a subsequent one later on. So kind of find out what the history of the aircraft is, and then if there's just absolutely no way that there's ever been a flight test recorded anywhere in the records, then I would go back to the FAA and ask them how they'd like you to handle that.
Okay, Larry's thinking about buying an RV with steam gauges, and he'd want to change it over to a glass panel. Would that be considered a major change?
Probably not. The only thing that might possibly be there, I mean, if the steam gauges are that much heavier than the glass panel, you may have a weight and balance issue there, but the panel is pretty close to the CG, so you're probably not going to have balance. There may be some weight change. I doubt it would rise to the level of being appreciable, and again, you have to use your better judgment to decide what appreciable would be. But in my guess would be no. That would just be a simple rebuilding of the panel. The weight's probably not going to be that much different. The balance is certainly not going to be that far off because the panel is so close to the CG anyway. So my guess would be, unless it's really an extensive rebuild and there's a lot of change in the weight, that would not be a major change. I would certainly consider doing a flight test of sorts just to make sure everything in the glass panel is working the way you want it to, but I don't think it's a major change. In my opinion, it's not a major change from the standpoint of going back to the FAA. Again, if you have that question in your mind and you really can't decide for yourself, call the FAA office and say, here's what I want to do. Would you consider this a major change or not? And that FAA office, wherever it happens to be, will tell you yes or no. And then once you get that in writing, put it with your records, and that way your decision's made for you.
Okay, Mike would like to know, if you buy a partially built kit and complete it, will you still be considered the primary builder and get the repairman certificate?
Okay, good question. And the answer to that one is it depends on how much is completed before you get the aircraft. If it's really substantially complete by a previous builder and you just do a few finishing touches, you put the interior in and bolt the wings on and put a prop on it and maybe a little bit of final installation of the avionics, but you don't really do much structural work on it, I doubt the FAA will consider you the primary builder. It certainly doesn't cost you anything to ask. But they're going to look at somebody that had a preponderance of the oversight of the building, has very, very good knowledge of the structure and systems of the aircraft. They want to know that you have the ability to know where to look and what to look for to do a proper condition inspection. And if you didn't do a lot of that construction, it's going to be pretty tough to convince them that you know all of the nooks and crannies to look in, to look for the proper wear points and the proper places where some inspection items may need to be covered. So depending on how complete that kit was when you got it, you may or may not be lucky enough to be convince them that you get the repairman certificate. Again, I would certainly make the application, but it's not a guaranteed deal.
Okay, Ken and a couple others have a similar question here. Are tech counselors or DAR sign-offs required in the aircraft maintenance records during the building of the aircraft?
Okay, good question. There is no strict requirement for that. The FAA documents say that there should be in-process inspections during the building of the aircraft, and they want somebody, and it can be an A&P mechanic, or it can be a tech counselor, or it can be another experienced builder that's already built that type or whatever. They would like to see somebody as a second set of eyes on that aircraft throughout the construction, and I would certainly encourage you to do that. If you have tech counselor inspections or A&P inspections recorded in the aircraft build records, your final inspection is going to go a lot easier for you. So I would highly encourage you to do that. Although there's no strict regulatory requirement for it, it's definitely something you want to very strongly consider.
Okay, Stuart states that his operating limitations have always said that, quote, no person may be carried in this aircraft during flight unless that person is essential for the purpose of the flight. He has a two-place glass there and wants to change that.
That is a flight test only requirement. If his operating limitations are worded that that's not in the flight test section, then their operating limitations are wrong. That is specifically a flight test restriction. You cannot carry anybody in the aircraft other than essential crew, and for almost all of our home-built aircraft, they're single pilot aircraft, so the pilot is the only essential crew. Once the flight test is signed off, that operating limitation should go away. Now, there may be, if you read those operating limitations carefully, there may be some place where it says something about phase 1 and phase 2, and in phase 2 it'll say that these operating limitations still apply, and it'll list a list of numbers. The number for that particular limitation should not be in that list for phase 2. If it is, then I would encourage him to go back to the FAA and have updated operating limitations issued that would eliminate that, because that is a flight test only requirement.
Okay, Doug would like to know that if a previous owner has surrendered the airworthiness certificate, can a new owner get another airworthiness certificate?
The answer is yes for the airworthiness certificate. The harder part of that is getting the registration transferred so that you can apply for the airworthiness certificate. Typically what people do when they surrender an airworthiness certificate is that they have this perceived notion that that's going to absolve them of liability. So they surrender the airworthiness certificate, they sell the aircraft as parts. They typically will not give a bill of sale for the aircraft, and that's the stumbling block. If you can't get a bill of sale from the last registered owner, you can't become the owner, which means you can't become the applicant for a new airworthiness certificate, because the owner has to be the applicant. So the stumbling block is getting the aircraft legally registered to you. Once you do that, if you can get past that, then getting an airworthiness certificate is not a problem. You can reapply, get a new airworthiness certificate for the reassembled, rebuilt aircraft, however you want to term that, and that's no problem. It's getting the ownership straightened out is usually the stumbling block there.
Okay, and Dana would like to know, are there specific documents required during the construction of the aircraft?
As far as specific, no. The FAA says you must have construction records that will verify that amateur builders did the major portion of the work. Now, they don't have any specific format for those records. They just say there has to be records. So I encourage pictures, lots and lots of pictures of the aircraft being built in your hangar, in your shop, pictures of you and your chapter members and your buddies working on the aircraft so that you see who was doing it, and the fact that it wasn't a pro builder that you hired to do it for you. Written documents of what day you did everything is good, not specifically required, but a written diary or a log, if you will, of what was done on each day is good. You do not have to keep any track of the time that you spent building the aircraft. From the standpoint of getting an airworthiness certificate, the FAA doesn't care how much time you spent on the build. They just want to know what tasks you completed. What did you fabricate? What did you assemble? Those are the things they want to have documented. So that's keep an eye towards documenting all the different tasks that you do. You fabricated some ribs, you assembled the wing, all those different fabrication and assembly tasks. If you do want to keep track of the time, it may come in handy for you later on down the road if you ever want to apply for an A&P certificate, because for an A&P certificate, the time you spent working on a home-built aircraft is applicable. So, and Jim Moss will tell you more about that in his webinar here coming up, I think, next week. You might want to keep track of the time for other purposes, but the time has no bearing on an airworthiness certificate for the aircraft itself. But you do want to document all the tasks that you and your buddies do as you construct the aircraft. So pictures are the best thing. Written notes are definitely in addition to that. That's a good idea. The more records, the merrier.
Okay, Guy would like to know how you handle the inspection/test flying of an airplane that you didn't build. One that's already been complete but not flown by the builder.
Okay. Actually, you would handle that, whether it's been flown by the builder or not is probably irrelevant, because you're going to transition into that aircraft. It's a new aircraft to you. You're unfamiliar with that individual aircraft and probably unfamiliar with that type. So you're going to go to your flight advisor, your EAA flight advisor, and the flight advisor is going to help you prepare yourself from the standpoint of putting together a flight test program that you're going to want to use. They'll help you prepare for flying the aircraft physically, as far as getting you some experience that will prepare you to fly that type of performance category of aircraft. You certainly can do the flight test period whether you built the aircraft or not. The builder does not have to be the test pilot. The test pilot does not have to be the builder. So certainly there are cases where an aircraft gets completed and certificated but not flown. You can buy that aircraft to complete the flight test. You would approach the flight test itself the same whether you're the builder or not, as far as what you're going to do on that flight test.
Yeah, Joe, I might just add, we did that. Me and another friend of mine purchased one that was already certificated, and the only thing we really had to consider specifically was just getting the flight test area moved. Unless you happen to live in that same area, you're probably going to have to coordinate it with your local flight standards district office to get a new operating limitation on where your flight test is based out of.
Right, that's correct. The flight test area for the initial flight test is called out in the operating limitations. So if you do purchase an aircraft and move it to a new airport, you'll have to get those operating limitations amended or changed to show a new flight test area so that you can go ahead and complete that flight test.
Okay, and Roger would like to know if you can do primary flight training in your amateur-built aircraft.
Right. Flight training is allowed. You would not want to be paying for the use of the aircraft unless it, well, actually with a LOTA even, you couldn't do primary training because the LOTAs are only for transition training. If you're going to do primary training, you're either going to own the aircraft yourself or you're going to borrow it from some friend of yours without expense so that you can do that training. There's nothing wrong with the training. The only problem gets into if you're paying for the use of the aircraft. That's where the FAA gets a little bit ruffled up because if you were allowed to pay for the use of the aircraft, that would open the door for people to be renting them out for flight training all over the place, and the FAA doesn't want that as a general practice for primary training. So if you have an aircraft available to you that's your own or it's your friend or a relative or something, they'll allow you to use the aircraft, you can certainly take your primary training in the aircraft. The only thing you have to consider there is A, finding a flight instructor that is familiar with that aircraft performance and is willing to do it. And once you get that conquered, you do your flight training, then you'll have to find a flight examiner that is willing to give you a flight test in that aircraft for your certificate issuance. The FAA is not required to give flight tests in experimental aircraft. The regulation actually says you're supposed to provide a standard category aircraft for a flight test for an airman certificate. The FAA will do it in an experimental aircraft at their discretion. So you're going to have to first find a flight instructor willing to fly that experimental under a training regime, and then you're going to have to find a pilot examiner that's willing to give you the practical test in that experimental aircraft. So a couple little hurdles to jump there, but the training is definitely available for you in that regard.
Well, Joe, this has been very informative. We still have a lot of questions left. There's no way we can cover them. If you still have questions that you want answered, where would you suggest that they go next, Joe?
Definitely, I would just go ahead and go to our info services. I still have it on the screen there. Give us a call or send us an email. We got a number of us here in the office that handle these questions on a daily basis, so one of us will be happy to get back to you. Just go ahead and use that info@eaa.org or the toll-free number, and we'll divvy up the questions amongst us, and we'll get you taken care of.
Great. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody for attending tonight. And just a reminder, this webinar should be posted by the close of business tomorrow at eaa.org/webinars. So thanks for attending and have a great night. And thanks to you, Joe.
Yep. Thanks a lot, everybody.